How long did the homework take you? Did it take, who took less than an hour to do the homework? Raise your hand. Who took between an hour and 3 hours? Raise your hand. Who took more than 3 hours? Please no. You took more than 3 hours? Deep research. Too much research, maybe. That's okay. We'll see how the grading comes out, and then we'll talk about the homework results. I just had a little resource crisis here because apparently there's no chalk in 3 different classrooms. I have now the most valuable commodity in this room, not homeworks. We have an oversupply of homeworks and an undersupply of chalk. Okay, I need some volunteers. I think I need 5 people. Maybe 5 people with hats. No, maybe not hats. We don't want hats on. How about let's make it easy? How about you 5 or 6 people? Can you put your coffee down? Is that all right? I need you 6 to come up here to the front. Don't worry. This will be painless. Six. You all will be jealous of these guys in a minute. Wait a second. Come up here. Come up here. Have you guys played a thing called the fishing game? Have you heard of a thing called the fishing game? Have you heard of it? No? Okay. So if you haven't heard of it, you haven't played it, then you're eligible. Come on over here. And I'll say the rules. Come, just stand right here. Okay. We're going to do a thing called the fishing game. And the fishing game is going, these are the fishermen. There's like too many of you for all of you to fish, but just imagine that these are your representatives, you know, 1 per row or something like that. The fishing game has 3 simple rules. First rule is don't talk. I talk. Second rule is that here are the fish. They are various sugary substances. Whoa, including rolling balls, chocolate globes. That's good. Help them out here. They might melt with the glass here. Okay, and I'm putting these on the light so you guys can see the fish. They're outlines, in fact. It might look like an outline, but it's actually a tasty fish. Okay, now you all come around here and try and get around it without getting blinded by this light, but try and get around it. You're going to be the fisherman around this thing. You're tallest. You should be over here in front. You can get in front. You can block it. And the shorter person's around here. Sorry, you are short. Okay, so the fish are in the fishing grounds. These are the fishermen. All of you represent boats. And there's 2 rules in this game. Number 1 is that in the first period, you get to fish. And all the fish that are left over at the end of the period, they reproduce. There's more fish, right? So each one of these becomes another one. There's 2. And there's the second period, you also fish. So the first period will last for 30 seconds, and the second period will last for 30 seconds, all right? And when I say go in the first period, you can start fishing. Any fish that are left over will double next time, right? And the goal, of course, is to get fish, which are sweet candies, right? So in that sense, I need a clock here, and I'm going to say, go fish. Those are fish. They're good. You have 20 seconds still. No wow, no talking. You can take or you can leave, but you can't talk about. Oh, there, that was obviously a more exciting fish. Now I see a lack of fish here, so I'm going to call an end to the fishing season. Okay, fishing is over. You can go sit down now. Thank you very much. Now, for those of you unlucky to have participated, I will trust that you will help distribute these around the class. There are fewer candies than there are people, so she's going to be diplomatic, otherwise known as monopoly power. So if you ever want to be friends, now is the time. Okay, so what happened there in terms of the harvest? Anybody? Do I point? Come on, somebody. What happened? They're all gone. Thank you. All right, that's how you get an A in this class. You state the obvious, right? Okay, all the fish are gone. Now, if you were a fisherman and you're looking back, you might say, wait a second. Did I get as many fish as I could have? No, right? But you did okay. But someone was taking your fish, right? Or your fish, or your fish, or somebody was taking the fish. In fact, there was a bit of a problem called, if I don't take the fish, someone else might take the fish. Did you recognize that happening there? Okay. Did you guys feel like someone was taking your fish if you left it there? So you picked it up, right? All right, so what happened is we have what's called an open access fishery. That means anybody can show up and take as many fish as they want. And when they take away the fish, other people don't have those fish. That's kind of obvious, just like addition and subtraction, right? But what happens is, as one guy shows up and he says, someone took all the fish. I got here at 10 o'clock today. I better get here earlier. So he gets up early in the morning and goes out at 9 o'clock and beats the other guy. And the other guy says, wait a second, I'm going to get up at 8 o'clock. So they actually race to pick up the fish, to get there first. Okay? This is sometimes called a tragedy of the commons. Right? That's the expression you probably heard. It's on your reading list. So you should be, I believe it's on the reading list, right? On the syllabus? Is it Hardin? Is that on the syllabus? Yes? Okay, and there's another one by H. Scott Gordon, who is also there. You should be reading both of those papers. I also assigned you Hayek, did I not? For Tuesday? Okay, so those papers for Thursday, put them on your queue of reading, okay? And I'll get you on Dolan papers in the near future. So look at the two fishing papers. The Tragedy of the Commons is actually not about fish. It's about the commons. But we'll talk about that today. So what happened is we had basically period 1 and 2, and we started with whatever it was, 20 fish. Now, if they had, yeah.
I don't understand just about this, because why don't we wait until the next season starts?
Why don't we?
Wait until the next season starts.
That's a good question. Why didn't you wait until the next period started?
That's why I said wow.
Well, that's what we're talking about right now. That's perfect. That's the example, right? Because if they had waited until the next period started, how many fish would they have had? 40, double, right? But they didn't, because there was a problem of, if I wait and someone else takes it, then I don't get anything. So I'm going to also take the fish, right? This is, if you've ever been around a table with a bunch of 6-year-old kids, and you put cake on the table, and it disappears very quickly. Like they'll stuff it in their face, right? Or maybe you are one of those kids. And then after that, they're all sick because they ate so fast, but they didn't want someone else to have the sugary cake, right? This is essentially the same problem with the fishery. It's the greed of, if I wait, someone else might take it. Now, if there was a single fisherman at that plot, what would the single fisherman have done? If you were the only guy next to that light, what would you have done? You would wait, right? Or if it was you and your brother, you'd be like, hey, bro, don't take the fish. We'll hang out together later on with a bunch of fish, right? So it turns out that this, if you want, commons can be managed in different ways. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It can be managed via 1, monopoly. 2, a partnership. This is not a very official set of numbers or classifications, but it is going to be helpful, okay? Partnership, which also includes a co-op, right? 3, property rights. 4, culture. And I'll call that fair. This is something economists don't talk about too often, but we're going to talk about it today for sure. And maybe I've missed something, but let's talk about all those different ways of managing this fishery. A monopolist has an incentive just to wait, right? Because if I wait, no one's going to take it, and I will double my profit by waiting for 30 seconds. A partnership or a cooperative would be something along the lines of, we're all in it together. No matter how many fish come out at the end in total, we'll divide them equally, right? So if you and I are partners and you take all the fish and we're divided it equally, you've got no reason. You already lose half your fish. If you wait, then we divide double the fish. So that's actually better. A cooperative is just the same thing with many people, right? A cooperative would have to be, but it would have to have enforcement so that no individuals from the cooperative go out and take their own little fish and say, this is my corner, or I take fish in the middle of the night kind of problem. Okay? This is actually a very, very well understood problem of resource management in the history of mankind. Every community has got its own version of it. The same thing as the opposite of the thing of the guy who goes walking his dog at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the dog poops on the ground, and the guy's like, nobody saw that, and they takes the dog away, and there's shit on the sidewalk in the morning, right? That's a different kind of tragedy, the commons. People who actually walk their dogs and don't pick up the dog poop, I don't know if it's legal or illegal in Vancouver, is it? There's no law about that. In cities that are more densely populated, believe it or not, there are laws that say if you have a dog, you've got to pick up the dog poop, right? And because a couple dogs here and there, after a while, becomes very hazardous for people walking around. And so that is a kind of pollution, and they say clean up the poop. So that's, it's a very dignified job for the owner of the dog. But what it does is it means that people either clean it up because they're walking their dog at 8 o'clock in the morning and everybody's watching, right? Or they sneak out in the middle of the night and they pollute with the poop, so to speak, right? So that's another kind of commons. Property rights. How would property rights work with this fishery? I've got 4 fishermen. How would I do a property rights solution to this? Sorry? A license for fish. That's actually a very good answer. It's not what I was thinking of, but it's perfect. So you have a license. What's another way of doing a property rights approach to the fishery?
Give all the fish to one fisherman and decides how to allocate them among the fishermen, or you can sell.
That's okay. That's a form of, that's also monopoly. I'll give you that. That's good. That's also the resource conserving way. Auction for those licenses potentially, right? But what's another way to do it besides actually the fish? Yes, basically. Essentially. Now, it makes a lot more sense. Having rights in fish, in tonnage, so to speak, makes a lot more sense than property, because the fish move around between the property. If you had trees, it would make sense to divide it up and say, okay, you can go here, but you can't go there. That belongs to somebody else. That's property rights, which is I'll get to that. Who talks about that? Oh, yeah, actually, I'll get to both of these guys in a second. And then there's this thing called culture, which is very strange. But culture is one of those things where it's like, well, you notice how people on the thing here, it's not like someone just like did this with their arm and took them all, right? People are like, oh, I'll take a couple, and then someone's like, I'll take a couple, and then it ended up being, did anybody not get fish? You all got some? Did you all get some? Did you get some also? So you all got some, roughly almost similar in a way, piles. Like, well, that person has 5. I think I have 2. I should have more. I mean, it was not, So what happened is, it was more or less polite. You take a turn, I take a turn, you take a turn, no more fish, shoot, right? So it was polite, except that it ended up collapsing the fishery. And but culture can be used as a mode of self-restraint. Many fishing communities in the past have had many fishing communities have had hundreds of years of living together, right? All the male fishermen are married to the sisters of other fishermen. They all have celebrations every year and so on. And what happens is that they watch each other and they know how far they can go, right? They know their boundaries. I was on holiday a couple years ago in Honduras, I think, or Nicaragua, on the islands in the Caribbean. And what was interesting is they had these islands had their major job was tourism and lobster. And they had, I don't know how it worked, but they had their own version of how to take lobster out of the water. Lobster are territorial beasts, right? They don't move around very far. And so they each had their own area where they could get the lobster. And they knew if someone else was in the area, then everybody knew. It was very obvious. But these guys actually said, someone came from a different island, they drove their motorboat across the sea, and they started basically stealing our lobster. Right? Now, there wasn't any explicit, license certificate or property, but it was what you would call traditional territory, right? You don't poach traditional territory. And so these guys said, hey, to the police on the mainland, you've got to stop these guys from violating our rights. But they were traditional rights. They were not formal property rights. And the police are like, whatever, because the police are also corrupt, right? Let alone Honduras is the murder capital of the world, right? So they have more important business picking up bodies and shipping coke to the U.S. And so lobsters, who cares? And these guys actually, the islanders, arrested the guys who came in a boat, like citizen's arrest, like stop, like we'll beat you to death if you don't stop kind of arrest. So the guy's like, okay, we're stopping. And then they called the mainland and said, okay, we have the criminal for you. Will you come please pick them up? And they said, okay, fine, we'll be there later today. So what they did is they enforced their cultural rights. These rights are very difficult to codify, to write down, often because someone will say, well, I know this belongs to so-and-so. And other people are like, well, how do you know? It's like, well, it's a long story. But everybody knows that kind of thing. There was an island in the South Pacific. What's the island that used to use rocks, very round rocks with a hole in the middle for money? Anybody remember that? It's like a trivia question. But there was an island, and they used to use, it was a big, large disc of stone with a hole in the middle that weighed a ton. It was very heavy. And because it was a pain in the ass to make these things, they were valuable. Don't ask me why, but that's essentially money. And what would happen is if someone said, oh, I'm going to buy a cow from you, they give them a little disc. If I'm going to marry your daughter, they give them a big disc because it was a big dowry kind of thing. And people would say, wow, you've got a lot of discs in front of your house, you're rich. Right? You can't do anything with it, but it's like having a pile of gold and nothing to do with it. And they'd be like, oh, that's a rich household, they have a lot of discs. But sometimes they'd be taking one of these discs from one house to another, like a bank transfer, you know, like an electronic transfer, over the ocean, and the boat would tip over and the rock would fall down, 20 meters underwater. And they couldn't get it out of the water, but everybody knew that that rock belonged to so-and-so, so he was still rich. It's true, right? But that actually was a form of culture. They recognized that guy, oh, he's got all these rocks under the ocean, he's totally rich. It's like, well, wait a second, right? So anyway, that was still a bank deposit as far as that was concerned. All of these things, all of these ways, together or separately, can be used to manage property, in a sense, or to manage resources. The person who's associated with property rights is Coase, who's on your reading list. He wrote a paper called The Problem of Social Costs. We'll get into that later in more detail because it's about pollution and environmental negative externalities. And the person who's associated mostly with a combination of culture and cooperation is Ostrom. Eleanor Ostrom, who is also on your mailing list. Eleanor Ostrom was, like many women in economics, insightful because she thought about things a little bit more differently than the guys. The guys are doing all the math and stuff. And the theory was that if you didn't have property rights, there would be a tragedy of the commons because people would just overexploit the resource, right? Whether it's fishery. The original tragedy of the commons refers to what? Did I tell you guys this, or did I tell the other class that? What does the original commons refer to?
The sheep.
Sorry?
The sheep.
Not the sheep so much as the land that the sheep would graze on, right? So this is an expression from England. You would have a big grassy area and a lot of houses around it, and everybody would have their sheep. Just like that. That's a sheep. Actually, it's probably a goat, but we'll call it a sheep. So they would have their property, and then someone would say, oh, I'm going to put my sheep on the grass to graze. And then someone else say, oh, I'm going to put my sheep on the grass also. And after a while, you get lots and lots of sheep on the grass, and say that the grass has a carrying capacity of 10 sheep. But everybody will say, well, if I put my sheep on there, my sheep will be feeding, and it'll be eating the food of everybody else's sheep. So I don't really care, because the benefit to me is my sheep has food. The cost to me is less food for everybody else. Do you see that logic? The benefit, so that's essentially what happens. And as everybody goes through this thought process, which actually I should probably get to the whole, it's also called the prisoner's dilemma. Has anybody heard of the prisoner's dilemma? Yeah, so it's the same thing as a prisoner's dilemma. And as you put more sheep on the grass, they're eating it and eating it and eating it until the commons is destroyed, right? So the paper, the 1968 paper by Harding, points out this problem, that the commons will be destroyed if there is not enough self-restraint or there's not property rights. I don't know if he actually talks about property rights. He almost just complains. That's his paper, mostly complaining about this problem. Now, the fact that the paper was published in 1968, as far as academics are concerned, he invented the idea. But the commons must be thousands of years old. Agriculture itself is 10,000 years old, and you would have thought that 10,000 years ago they'd still have this problem when they're domesticating livestock and so on. So just because a scientist wrote it down in 1968 doesn't mean that humans hadn't been doing it for thousands of years. And Eleanor Ostrom said, now wait a second, I wonder how humans have been doing this for thousands of years. And so she just went out and started looking around, asking questions, right? She wasn't an anthropologist, she was a political scientist. But she did win the Nobel Prize in Economics a couple years ago, and then she unfortunately died last year. But she ran a very, very good research group, actually, in Indiana, asking, how do people do stuff? What's the tradition? Does it work? Is it sustainable? She did work in Nepal on forestry and all kinds of stuff. And what she found out is that various cultures had various ways of controlling these commons. And what it meant was that they had tried something this, they had tried something that, and over time they figured out a way of managing the commons so that it wasn't destroyed. So there was no tragedy. So what this guy wrote down in 1968, and everybody took for granted for 20 years, academics, by the way, who never leave school, remember, right? Academics sit in their office and they understand the world according to the book. But then if you go outside and you read and you talk to people, you find out the books aren't always correct, and that's what she found out. And so she started writing lots and lots of papers and books about why, hey, this stuff is going on that's different. It's a revolution in economics, but people outside are like, God, you guys are catching up with us, right? So there's different ways of managing the commons. Just because it's not easy to write down doesn't mean it doesn't work. An example of this, which I read a book about it. It's called the book was called Priests and Programmers. Priests and Programmers. And it referred to the way that rice was cultivated in Bali, in Indonesia. Bali has a long history that's separate from Indonesian statehood, but they grow rice there, and they had a whole bunch of traditions about how to grow rice. And most of them were coming out of the temples, right? And they're a Hindu religion there. Hindu religion is extremely complicated. I don't know if anybody understands it, honestly. But it has all kinds of variations. And what the religion did is it said, on this day, you're going to have a ceremony where everybody comes together. And on this day, someone is going to have water going down the hill to this farm. And if this guy does the right thing, then he gets water to his farm. And this guy has more land, and so he's going to get water later. They had all these rules about who would have water and who would get irrigated and how to allocate the water and the land and the timing and so on. And a bunch of basically academics showed up in the 1960s and said, okay, you guys have been doing this for over 1,000 years, but we have new technology. We're going to help you with scientific rice growing. And they brought new hybrid seeds, and they said, you have one harvest or two harvests a year. We're going to go for 3 harvests a year. You're going to have more food. You're going to get rich. You can buy cars. You're going to develop, and you're going to have TV sets. It's going to be great. So they tried doing all these technologies and all these changes, and they put in the rice, and they did the water, and they did the irrigation, and they ran into some problems. The first problem was there wasn't enough water because it was hybrid rice. It needed more water. The second problem was, a much bigger problem, is that instead of having a lot of plots, and this plot will be grown in January, and this plot will be grown in March, and this plot will be grown in February, and so on, instead of having plots that would be grown at different times of the year, take my word for it, I'm not a rice agronomist, but you can stagger the crops, right? And what they ended up doing is they said, okay, let's plant all 4 plots at once so they grow efficiently together. And what that did is, yes, it was very efficient in terms of you go out, you do all the work, and then you come back 6 weeks later, you do all the work again. The problem was the bugs loved it. And the bugs that eat rice, in the old system, they would not be able to move from field to field because as they harvested the rice, they would burn the rice straw, and the bugs would all die, and they would have nowhere to go. They couldn't go next door because there was no rice there, right? Because that field was fallow. But because they were synchronizing all of the production, let's say, those steps, the bugs were infesting the entire area, and they lost over half of their crop, 90% at times of their crop. So forget your double yield. If you lose 90%, you're screwed, right? They were spending more resources to make less food. So the programmers were fired, and they went back to the priests and said, come on, priests, make that God happen again. So they actually, the whole idea, and I went there when I went to Bali, and I checked out these temples, and I'm not part of the culture, but you can see they have a very, very vibrant, functioning system. And essentially, it's like all these ceremonies, all the incense, all the praying, all the food, all the offerings, whatever that is, whether or not you believe in God, it keeps the rice growing, right? And for these guys, that was a good God to worship because they were eating. So that was a traditional way of doing stuff that doesn't fit simply into a mathematical or a technical way of doing things. And if you think about wherever you come from, your society, your culture, when you were a kid, think about what you did when you were a kid in terms of now we're going to kill the pig, or this is what we do with the chicken, or your parents always bring over here and we always do that. Those kinds of traditions of sharing food or resources are all based on these cultures. They're informal. People don't write them down. Sometimes they take them for granted. But you see how they actually are a form of insurance, right? If I have food now, I give you food, and when you have food, you give me food back. Those kinds of traditions are way older than Western academic thought or Western structured thought. So that's how they've managed resources over all these years. And great. So that's what I want to talk about in terms of the property rights. And let me also give you a word here in terms of jargon that I'll be using. Institutions. Right? Now, an institution is a word that can mean many things. In this class, I'm going to define it a little bit more carefully. An institution is essentially a formal rule or an informal norm, right? So it's either written down as a rule or it's something cultural, let's say, okay? Rules and norms. And institutions can take on, can be very, very strong and deep, or they can be very flexible, as in weak and shallow, right? So the strongest, deepest institution, the reason I'm using the word institutions is because when we go through resources and we talk about trees and we talk about fisheries and we talk about oil and we talk about the environment and about clean water, all of those things in terms of managing those resources or those environmental goods, the quality of management will almost always be directly related to institutions. The most important factor will be institutions. Institutions are things like, do you go the speed limit or do you not go the speed limit, right? Do you go to work on Saturday or do you not go to work on Saturday? And those things are important, and they're based, you can call them culture, but they're important in understanding how resources are managed around the world. Because resource management changes from place to place. Within countries, it can be very radically different. And across countries, it also is quite different. So that's what I mean with this word institutions. Let me keep describing it. So the deepest foundation of an institution, if you want, is going to be something like culture. Right? Culture is your religion, it's your language, it's your history. It's stuff that really is very deep in what you grow up with. It's the tradition. It's literally what we do, right? What we do and what they don't do kind of culture, all right? It's stuff that you may not write down, but everybody knows. On top of culture, you're going to have the first something written down, which will be something like a constitution. A constitution is a basic law that shall be respected regardless of who you are, and it shall not change except with a lot of difficulty, right? Some countries have constitutions that change every year or two. Usually they're not very well managed. Egypt is having a new constitution right now because they keep going back and forth about who's going to own everything. But constitutions that last for 20, 50, 100 years, those constitutions tend to be more respected as very basic laws that shall not be violated. On top of the Constitution, you're going to have laws. On top of the laws, you're going to have rules. And on top of those, you're going to have essentially transactions. And what happens here is that as you go up, this is less and less duration. Transactions are quite fast. You go buy a coffee this morning, that's a transaction, right? There's an institution of transacting for coffee at Starbucks. It's not very deep. It's not, your culture. If someone else comes along and says, okay, instead of swiping your card, we're going to give you the coffee and we'll do something else, whatever, you're changing the transaction. And somehow but that is an example of an institution, a very short-run institution. So constitutions last a long time. Laws last less long, but they can change on the circumstances. We've got to do a law about whatever. I don't even know. Who can build a house? Rules are what you do when you are saying, okay, the rule is, in this class, the rule is we start at 8:30. It'll last for this semester, and then the rule goes away, right? The law called breaking the speed limit's not going to go away after the end of the semester. And then transactions are, I'm here today. You don't have to worry too much about the order of these or how significant each one is compared to another. I just want to outline it to you. There's a paper behind this that is not obligatory. If you're interested in it, it's by Williamson, 2000. If you want to see this paper for whatever reason, because you're doing your briefing or your blog post, because you don't need to, but if you do, email me and I'll make sure you get a copy of it. I'm putting a transaction cost in between you and that paper. If you really want to get it, you're going to remember to email me. If you don't want to get it, that's cool. That's how unimportant it really is to read the paper. So institutions, they change very slowly or they can change very quickly, and they change as a result of people interacting over things. You took too many fish today, so we're going to have a new rule called if you made a lot of fish yesterday, you don't get so many fish today. Right? That would be an example of the way institutions kind of evolve. They evolve often around fairness. Okay, so then let's change gears for a second, because I'm laying out a big chunk here, and I'm going to get to another one, but after a step in the middle. Another big chunk. Okay. So if I have two demand curves, and I want to allocate this phone to one person or the other, I pretty much have an idea that a single unit of phones is probably going to go to Miss Right instead of Miss Left. Right? I'm just going to look at that and say, I see a higher value on the demand curve. The phone is probably going to end up over there. Right? It's a private good, this phone. Only one person can own it. And when one person owns it, and once they own it, they can keep it. But there's only one, so the other person can't own it also. That's a phone is a private good. But what if this was not a phone? In fact, this was a rainbow. It's a rainbow. And if I own it, you can also own it. Right? Or if I enjoy it, you can also enjoy it because, oh, it's a rainbow. We can all look at the rainbow. Right? All of you, in fact, can enjoy the rainbow. So the rainbow actually, in a sense, is non-exclusive and it's not rival. Right? That means that non-exclusive, like I can't control it because it's everywhere. There's rainbow. And it's not rival, as in if I enjoy the rainbow, it doesn't mean you can't enjoy the rainbow. Right? A rainbow, in fact, is more like a public good. Let's do it this way. Shoot. I'm going to have to redo that. Okay. So I have a phone, and I've got a rainbow. Now, so they're different. So I have, in the one circumstance, I've got the phone, and on another circumstance, if this is a rainbow, it's different in the way people enjoy it. It requires a different management paradigm. If it's a phone, and I own it and you don't own it, we should have a thing called, you can't steal from me, that's bad. Because if he steals from me and I steal from him, and after a while we kill each other, then you're going to have a bit of chaos, right? Your society is not going to do very well. The guys next door who have figured out how to be nice to each other are going to come over and kill you and take over all your land, right? It's actually probably about as correct as you're going to get in terms of social evolution. People that could not cooperate on a basic level would end up being killed by the guys next door who could, right? Organized religion is very much in the same logic. Our God tells us we should conquer you, and by the way, our God tells us we should be nice to each other. So we're going to be nice to each other. Wow, we all like each other. Let's go kill them. Okay. And then we go over there and kill them. Now, if they actually are still fighting with each other over the phone, they're going to be sitting there fighting away, and then these foreigners come in and wipe us out, right? This is actually one of the things that happened with the Inca Empire in South America when the Spanish showed up after Columbus, like in the 15th century, 16th century. So the Inca had just had this huge civil war to control the land because Dad gave the property to two of his sons, right? This is not just Shakespeare, this happens, right? And the two sons decided to fight. Genghis Khan did the same thing with his sons, right? So they decide to fight. They fight, they fight, they fight. Finally, someone wins, but both of them have lost half of their armies. And the Spanish show up with a couple swords and horses, and they kill everybody and take over everything, right? So in some ways, you win the war, but you lose, or you win the battle, but you lose the war, and that's a problem of culture and property rights. Now, so cultures a long time ago figured out how to manage phones and figured out how to manage rainbows. From an economic perspective, we should think about how these things should be valued in terms of what's socially efficient, let's say, in terms of production, right? If we have a phone as a private good and the value, I'm going to be Mr. Right, you're going to be Mr. Left, okay? If the value to me is up here or whatever, I'll pay this price of $100. This is an old phone, right? And you have a value of, say, $50. So the value to me is 100 and the value to him is 50, and in a marketplace, I'm going to buy this phone for $100 and I'm happy, and you don't have it and you're happy. It doesn't matter, right? It works out. In economics, we know that the value of the phone is 100. We also know that the private property is going to, plus the value, is going to give an incentive for someone to supply the phone. If the cost of supplying the phone is 150, are we going to sell any phones? Yes or no? No, right? Cost is greater than value, no market. But if it is lower than 100, then fine. But how do we value this if it's a rainbow? Broken rainbow. How do we value this if it's a rainbow? What do you think? Yes, you. How much is it worth if it was a rainbow? This is the same demand curves, but it was 1 unit of rainbow. That's right. It doesn't cost anything, but what's it worth? What's it worth to us? We are society. What's it worth? You. What are you? What? It depends on what? That's good. I've got some preferences. What is it? The girl's spinning and looking down. What's it worth? Huh? Nothing? Well, it's worth something. We love rainbows, don't we? I love it twice as much as you. Yeah. Almost. I'm willing to pay 100 though. And the other guy's only willing to pay 50. So if I ask him for 75, he'll say, eh. Right? So the value is both numbers together. Right? 100 plus 50. Because we both enjoy it. Right? If there's a rainbow up there, whoop, 100, that's a double rainbow, I'm so excited. And he's like 50, okay, 50, whatever, having a good day, right? You got a rainbow. So the valuation, the key that I'm getting at here is the value of a public good is the sum of the values of the public enjoying the good, let's say, right? The value of a private good is essentially the higher of the values, the person who ends up with it. And you can look at this if you aggregate demand curves. So if I'm going to aggregate these two into one demand curve, then I'm going to have, let's make this over here around the intercept. Okay? I'm going to take this part as a start of the demand curve, and then when I get to this intercept, I'm going to aggregate it. So then I'm going to have a kink, and it's going to go like this. Do you remember doing that in Econ 1? That kink demand curve from an aggregation? The kink is because until here, this guy is not even in the market, right? So this is my demand curve here. This is aggregate demand at the higher prices, right? Above here, this guy's not even participating in the market. So as soon as the price drops to, say, let's call that 60, that intercept, as soon as it drops to 60, now I add them together and I make an aggregate demand curve that goes out here. This is something that you did in Econ 1. And what the aggregate demand curve shows you really is, number one, if there's one unit of the good, it goes to me at that value. It's the same thing as what we showed up here. If there's many, many units of the good, then both of us are going to be consuming some of the good. Right? That's just normal, everyday economics of private goods. But then if we're going to do a public good, private, public. This is the basic theory of public goods, by the way. You probably don't need more than that. If we're going to do the public good, we actually sum vertically. And so what happens is this 100 and this 50 at one point actually goes up to 150. On one unit at 150, I'm going to have this. And in fact, it's going to be something like this. And it's only going to go out as far as it's going to go like that, basically. Because it's a sum of these two goods here, the sum of these two demand curves. In the terrible drawing, you should see my point. Right? The main point is that the value of one good is the sum total when it is a public good, because it is non-rival. I can consume it and you can consume it. And this logic is what justifies, for example, the expenditure on a public good. If we're going to build this rainbow machine, it's worth 150. So if it costs us $100 to build, or $120, let's say, to build a rainbow machine, from a social cost-benefit perspective, cost is 120, benefit is 150. It's a good idea. But if you asked me to buy it alone, I'd be like, no, it's not worth 120 to me. It's worth 100. If you ask him to buy it, it's the same logic. If you ask who's going to do it voluntarily, it's like, well, I'm not going first, right? It's the same thing as the fish. Well, let him leave his fish on there. I'm taking my fish off. It's the opposite. It's the flip side of that, right? So if you ask voluntary contributions, it's not going to happen. This is the justification for taxation. This is a justification for, I'll take 50 off of you, I'll take 100 off of me, or rather prorated, 40 and 80. 40 and 80 gets us to 120. And then we're both happy. We have a surplus. The difference between 120, which we pay, and 150 is our benefit. There's 30 units of surplus, right? That is a justification for public goods and public goods expenditures. And that is what you can use in terms of the theory of government and what government should be doing. Many, many governments around the world provide private goods. There is no economic justification for that. There's a huge political rationale for that. If the government owns the housing and you want to live with a roof over your head, then you're going to do what the government tells you because you want to have a house, right? Housing is a private good, though. There's no reason for the government to control housing. But the government uses housing as a way of getting rewards and controlling people. Public goods, however, there is a justification for public goods, right? The most obvious public good is basically law and order, right? We want to have rules. We want to have honesty and police so people don't steal from each other, for example, right? This is a very important public good. And nobody wants to pay. If I say you pay for all the police and everybody else will benefit, you're like, whoa, okay, but wait, why me, right? But if I say everybody here is going to pay $1 towards a cop that costs $50, then we all get a benefit for a piece of the cost. And in order to justify our inclusion, you have to have a tax. It has to be a forced levy. Sometimes it'll be voluntary. If you're in a small enough community, you can have a voluntary contribution towards a public good. Because you go knock on the door and say, hey neighbor, I know you, we partied last night, give me some money, and we'll build a whatever, a big party house, right? And so on and so on and so on. If there's few enough people that we all know each other, then it's possible to do that without police force. It's possible to do that with social connections and so on. But a bigger society, you need to have police force. This is going to be a topic which comes up again. But let me finish up today with, keep this in mind, but with this little box here. Because these are going to be 4 types of goods that are very important when we're talking about resources and the environment. You heard before about normal goods and giffen goods and luxury goods. We're not talking about those. Okay? We're talking, almost all goods really are, that we're going to talk about in this class are normal goods in terms of the demand curve. That's all you don't even have to worry about your demand curve. Just ignore that. These ways of thinking about goods, these 4 ways, are based on, is the good rival or non-rival? This little tilde means not rival. You can write down non-rival if you want. And non-excludable. Is the good excludable or non-excludable? Is it rival or is it non-rival? Excludable means I own it, you can't have it. Non-excludable means we all own it together. Rainbows. Right? If it's rival, that means if I'm using it, you can't use it. It's a different way of thinking about it. Right? That means if I'm on the phone, you can't talk on the phone at the same time. So those are the 2 characteristics. And what these are called are private goods. And these are called public goods. You already know that. But the off diagonals are interesting. A non-rival excludable good is called a club good. You go in the club, you're a member of the club, right? So you can be excluded from the club or allowed in the club if you pay your dues. But once you're in the club, you can use all the facilities. You can go to the pool, you can wash your hands, you can get one of those little towels and dry your hands with the towels, the little cloth ones. You can go play golf, and so on. The club will have rules for allocating its common areas, right? The golf course, you've got to sign up and get one of the tees and so on. Now, that's a non-rival excludable good, and a non-excludable rival good is a common pool good. It's non-excludable as in everybody can get to it. It's the commons, right? And it is rival because if my sheep is eating the grass, your sheep can't eat the grass. But as we just spent some time discussing with Ostrom and so on, just because it's common pool doesn't mean a tragedy of the commons. Just because it's non-excludable and rival doesn't mean that it's going to be overexploited. It just means that there has to be some way of doing that to avoid that problem. It could be self-constraint. Virtue is a virtue for a reason, right? People will not use it because of self-constraint, but it could be other reasons, other kinds of cultural reasons. So these are the 4 types of goods, and a resource can be any one of these 4 boxes, or it can evolve around those boxes. As an example, I can have a pool in my house. My pool, my house, right? And it's only 1 lane wide. It's one of those little lap pools. So it's rival. If someone else gets in the pool, there's no space for me. It's only one person can be in the pool, and it's excludable. It's my pool. So I can have that, or I can have a pool in the club. It's got many lanes. There's never too many people there because it's, expensive club, no one goes. So it's excludable, but non-rival. Then maybe the club says, let's have kids' day. You can bring your kids. And now what happens is all the kids show up. They're already inside the club, so they're not excludable from the pool. And it's rival because there's 20 kids that want to be in the pool at once. So the same pool is now turned into a common pool good. There's almost a tragedy of the commons. Some adult will say, okay. All the 5 to 10-year-olds out of the pool, right? Only the 10 to 15-year-olds can be in the pool, or whatever. They'll figure out some rule. Or they'll say, ooh, chocolate cake, and all the kids will get out of the pool and start eating cake, and then there's no more problem of congestion, right? And then we have a non-excludable non-rival. When the kids get out for the cake, there's only one kid in there, and he's doing this. It's like a public good, right? He's got plenty of space. Another kid can get in there. They don't even run into each other. So the exact same item can be in a different box depending on the conditions, depending on the management paradigm, let's say, right? The important thing is it can move to other boxes because of organic reasons, or you can change the rules so you move it to a new box and you make it, for example, a sustainable pool, right? That's the key that we'll be talking about when we talk about resource management for this semester.